Hello, my name is Michelle Ruiz. I am the program coordinator at the US Latinx Art Forum. My pronouns are she, her. I am a cisgender Mexican-American woman in my 30s and have straight dark brown hair. As we begin this event, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor our ancestral grounds and support Indigenous peoples' ongoing stewardship and struggles to protect their cultural resources and homelands. I'm currently broadcasting from my home in Berwyn, Illinois, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. It is a pleasure to welcome you to Resistance, Reaffirmation, and Resilience, the second installment of X as Intersection, Latinx Artists in Conversation. In 2016, the US Latinx Art Forum has supported equity in the art world by championing artists and arts professionals dedicated to Latinx art. In 2021, we partnered with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the New York Foundation for the Arts to administer the Latinx Artist Fellowship. The Latinx Artist Fellowship is designed to address the systemic and longstanding lack of philanthropic and institutional support for Latinx artists. The fellowship awards $50,000 in unrestricted funds to each member of a multi-generational cohort of 15 visual artists each year for an initial commitment of 5 years. This award is the first significant prize of its kind and celebrates the plurality and diversity of Latinx artists and aesthetics. We are honored to be a partner for this groundbreaking initiative. Next slide, please. Today's event is part of the X as Intersection series, which brings the inaugural cohort of fellows into conversation with curators with a sustained commitment to Latinx art. It is our pleasure to introduce our co-hosts for this conversation. Rita Gonzalez, the Terri and Michael Smooke Curator and Department Head of Contemporary Art of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and Sylvia Orozco, co-founder and executive director of the Mexic-Arte Museum in Austin, Texas.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon to everyone joining us for the second talk in USLAF series. Am I on? So, yes. Okay. Yes, great, thank you. Sorry. For this panel, I'm excited that LACMA is joining with Mexic-Arte to present a cross-generational dialogue. As a curator who's been invested in increasing the visibility of Latinx art and advancing its dialogue within contemporary contexts in Latin America and beyond, I am thrilled to co-host a cross-section of the recipients of the USLAF Award on this panel series X as Intersection. We are having this dialogue in virtual space, which provides challenges, but there are also some openings that have occurred that enhance our connections across differently scaled institutions, across generations, across regional specificities. Rather than focus on the word Latinx itself, we are approaching the X as a site of intersection, treating it spatially. We hope that the experiences of our amazing panelists today will touch upon Latinx as a site for problematization, and questioning. Beyond the X of the series title, the sub-themes of resistance, reaffirmation, resilience have special meaning in that they echo the significant early 1990s exhibition, Cara, Chicano Art, Resistance, and Affirmation. Cara focused on Chicanx identities and brought together many different types of artistic production, from graphics to experimental video, muralism to performance. The exhibition was an affirmative move generated within the Chicanx communities, self-organized, self-historicized, but with the ultimate goal of reaching broader institutional contexts and audiences. I think it's important to note that it has taken decades of self-organizing for artists and curators to have an impact on the official networks of power. For this panel, my co-organizer Sylvia Orozco and I asked Adriana Corral, Rafa Esparza, Delilah Montoya, Celia Alvarez Munoz, and Michael Menchaca to present on what it has meant to contend with historical and contemporary challenges over the last couple of years. What has it been like to work in isolation and/or with community over these last 2 years? How are notions of resilience, resistance, and reaffirmation playing out in their practices with the pandemic? And how have they continued to respond to calls for racial and economic justice? How have their relationships to site and community engagement changed over the last 2 years? Since we have 5 incredible presenters, I will turn over to Sylvia Orozco to introduce these artists as we hope to make time for conversation amongst ourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I also am thrilled to be here today working with Rita Gonzalez of LACMA and Latinx Forum, and an incredible group of talented and committed artists. I'm going to be presenting the artist, Adriana Corral. Adriana Corral's subjects are framed by her research on human rights abuses and historical narratives focused on themes of memory and erasure. Corral's work is rooted in her own memories and experiences of growing up in El Paso, Texas, which have compelled her to examine the nuances of immigration, citizenship, economic trade, labor, and public health in national and international contexts. Rafa Esparza. Rafa Esparza's multidisciplinary works reveals his interest in history, personal narratives, and kinship, his own relationship to colonization, and the disruptive genealogies that it produces. Using live performance as his main form of inquiry, Esparza employs site-specific locations, materiality, memory, and what he calls non-documentation as primary tools to investigate and expose ideologies, power struggles, and binary forms of identity that establish narratives, history, and social environments. Esparza's recent projects are grounded in labor with land and adobe making, a skill learned from his father, Ramon Esparza. In so doing, the artist invites brown and queer cultural producers to realize large-scale collective projects, gathering people to build discursive sites and networks to support outside of traditional art spaces. Michael Menchaca. Michael Menchaca is a multidisciplinary Chicanx artist active in disrupting racist narratives that target Latinx, Black, and Indigenous people of color using print media and new media formats to generate anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist visions of the world. As a de-indigenized Mexican-American born and raised in San Antonio, a community with colonial roots in military and civil policing practices, Menchaca, like many Texans, is constantly mediating the internalized racist and colorist beliefs embedded in them by the legacy of white supremacy in the Americas. Menchaca creates multimedia installations that apply a combination of printmaking, painting, and digital animation, exploring Latinx identities in a hyper-mediated American landscape. Delilah Montoya. Delilah Montoya is a self-identified Chicana artist who poses questions about identity, power, land, borders, gender, community, and family that she explores through either print or photographic processes that tell specific stories pointing to larger experiences. One can think of Montoya as an artist, scientist, anthropologist, sociologist, and humanist. Her works are highly cerebral and conceptual on the one hand, and aesthetically dense and psychologically complex on the other. She is a founding member of the artist and activist collective Sin Huellas, Without a Trace. Based in Texas, Sin Huellas brings attention to the actual practices of ICE, immigration and customs enforcement, and the frequent tragedies surrounding the daily realities of families held in detention. Celia Alvarez Munoz. Celia Alvarez Munoz is a conceptual multimedia artist known for her writing, photography, painting, installation, and public art. Her work has been informed by her experience growing up along the US-Mexico border, a physical as well as psychological space where two cultures intersect, and the constant navigation of that bilingual, bicultural border zone. Alvarez Munoz taught art to students of all levels, and her work frequently references education and learning, particularly the challenges and misreadings of language acquisition. Now, Adriana Corral will present her work.
Thank you all for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. And for those who took the time to prepare for today's event and conversation, and also to the translators. We can go to the next image. So at the beginning of the pandemic, a dear friend and the chief curator of MASMOCA asked me and a small group of artists, what does resilience mean to you? And just to briefly summarize, for me, resilience is this kind of inability to stay stagnant, and it really requires a constant movement, and a movement through hardship, a movement through uncertainty, movement through breath, and movement through healing. So this is something that I've kept with me and in the projects that I'm working on. So two projects that I'll be talking about today include this one, Resilient Matter, that I did for Prospect in New Orleans. And the other is something that I've been gradually expanding on for about 15 years now. So in the process of my project for Prospect, Hurricane Ida impacted New Orleans and the Gulf region and the neighboring parishes, and almost exactly 16 years to the date when Hurricane Katrina impacted the area. And so at that moment, I revisited the mission statement of Prospect, and it said, what could the role of the artist be in rebuilding the city? And so in thinking about that, it was in this moment that I decided to shift the direction of the project and reallocate the funding to provide mutual aid to impacted communities. And it took an incredible amount of time and work to learn about those communities and how they were impacted. But what were those mutual aid efforts that were happening on the ground? And so after this kind of recalibration, I connected to an incredible group of core women that aided me in this process and really connected me to other scholars, grassroots organizers, attorneys, and those who were directly impacted. So two of those organizations that received the funding, one is the Pointe-au-Chien tribe and the other is Álvarez. In this image, this is the region of where the Pointe-au-Chien tribe is. And they're along the Gulf Coast in the water. And in that area, it almost looked as though a bomb had gone off. And in this image, you can see how there was a home that was completely destroyed and leveled on that platform. Can we go to the next image? And then this is the organization Álvarez, who also received the aid. And their mission statement is to really support incarcerated youth, undocumented, or DACA status youth as well. And this organization really was so impactful within their community because they took on the role to help families who were undocumented and didn't receive FEMA aid or anything else. And so what's exciting about these two organizations is that we're continuing to work on extended projects. And that also includes another organization, Glass Half Full. We're partnering with Tulane University, the Amistad Research Center, the Rivers Institute in New Orleans. And each of these organizations have a strong partnership with Tulane University and those other ones. And so we can go to the next slide. So the other series that I'm working on began with this telegram and kind of this history of the delousing facilities that were established along the US-Mexico border. And so learning about this through the historian, Dr. David Romo's book, A Ringside Seat to a Revolution, it really just sent me on this path to want to learn more. And I was really able to extend that research at an artist research fellowship at the Smithsonian. And so it was during that time that I was able to find a wealth of information from archival material like documents, correspondence letters, official letters, blueprints, maps, and images. And in the sanitation process, the US federal government was using kerosene, Zyklon B, cyanide-based chemicals on predominantly Mexican workers and second-class citizens. And all of this was happening before World War II. And so this kind of political targeting of Mexican immigrants as contagious carriers for disease really created this kind of atmosphere of racialized paranoia in California, in Texas, and the Southwest. And this is a sentiment that officials really capitalized on to implement harsher border control policies. And so we can go to the next image. So from these findings, I've been able to create works from my gathered research in various ways. And so I'm using and kind of drawing from these documents that I'm using and using printmaking elements in kind of unconventional ways, but also using copies from the National Archives. And we can go to the next image, as well as taking these kind of blueprints and etching them into copper and working with copper. So I would like to take this moment to introduce our next speaker, Rafa Esparza.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Adriana. I've been a huge fan of your work for a long time, as well as all of our peers on the panel here today. I'm grateful to be virtually connected with you all this morning. Before I get started, I wanted to provide some visual description, and I'll try my best to do this as we move along through my intro. My name is Rafa Esparza. I use he, him, his, el pronouns. I'm a person with brown complexion, a light mustache. I'm sitting against a white wall with sketches pinned onto it. I'm donning a black hoodie sweater and a blue baseball cap that reads "Fuck la policía," which translates into "Fuck LA police." Could we move into the first image, please? I'm an interdisciplinary artist whose work moves through large-scale installation, collaboration, sculpture, and painting, but primarily through live performance. I've invested a large part of my practice to help build discursive networks of support through experimental collaborative projects that entail transforming large amounts of soil into thousands of adobe building blocks, and in turn, rebuilding traditional art spaces out of them, and extending those spaces to brown artists, allowing us to collectively reconsider and reimagine the history, parameters, and the politics of white space as reified in traditional art spaces. This first image is an installation shot of an adobe rotunda I built in the Whitney Biennial of 2017 with the help of my father, Ramon Esparza, and shows portraits of brown men hanging on the curved adobe wall taken by Dorian Ulises Lopez Macias. The image is foregrounded by a black lava rock sculpture by Beatriz Cortez. Next slide, please. When I say that my work moves through these mediums, I'm attending literally to how it materializes through different forms, but also conceptually and physically how the work exists in space. I favored outdoor public sites with a proximity to communities. It's felt important for me and the work to be seen by communities that historically have been absented in mainstream culture as makers and audience. In the La Calle, for instance, which this is a shot of, I initiated a guerrilla street performance in the historic fashion district in Los Angeles with a group of over 20 trans, queer, BIPOC artists, fashion designers, and performers. The performance moved through 3 blocks of the Santee Alley, a fashion thoroughfare market historically attended by poor working class BIPOC communities. The performance showcased the artwork of makers whose work have had a strong presence in queer spaces, but largely as part of the queer LA nightlife. This image shows a person parading through a busy corridor, donning a red fluffy gown and a wide open smile facing the viewer. They are surrounded by crowds of people cheering and clapping and viewing from varying positions. Next slide, please. In other works, a performance takes to the physical sites of power my actions seek to address. In this instance, the White House, where I, along with a company of collaborators, ensconce my body in a concrete replica of a column, like the ones that line the porticos of the White House. The work took the violent rhetoric of 45 presidency and provided the symbolic gesture to combat and elucidate the also symbolic yet impactful racist and xenophobic rhetoric of 45. The image shows myself stanchioned in a grass field against the White House as its backdrop. I am wearing a face mask and using a hand chisel and hammer to break through the concrete column that I am ensconced in up to my chest. Next slide, please. Recently, I've evolved the material that I've been using to build brown architectures and I brought them into the intimate space of painting. I've been building panels out of adobe where I've been making portraits of family, friends, and community. I see this practice as one of healing, one of restoration, and one of critical witnessing. It's a work that brings literally the bodies up against land and using this figure ground material proximity between the sitter and soil to create a space where we can think of our varying, yet very distinct and specific, but also interconnected histories as they relate to land. This first image shows a person resting their head on their arms, leaning against the wall. They're looking directly at the viewer they're looking directly at the viewer. The next slide. I'm just going to describe this image. The image is a taquero that's in my neighborhood that me and my friend used to visit for years, someone that we actually had a crush on. But the image is a painting of someone taking a taco order from behind a reflective window. There is a green light glowing at the top of the painting, and more subdued yellow-green glow on the right-hand side of the portrait. Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation. I'm going to pass it on to Michael Menchaca. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafa, for that introduction. I especially want to say thanks to Claudia Zapata, for whom I would not have the honor of participating in as an exclusive member of this inaugural fellowship cohort without their nomination. Thanks to Sylvia Orozco, Rita Gonzalez, Mary Thomas, Michelle Ruiz, Holly, and the team at LACMA Education for organizing this talk and for the invitation to speak to you all today. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start off by addressing what it means for me to identify as Latinx. In recent months, there has been a concerted effort by right-wing media outlets to transform this term, Latinx, from its origins as an inclusive identity centering LGBTQAI+, Indigenous and Black shared unity, power, and resistance within the Latino community. And instead, Latinx is weaponized and mischaracterized as something that is being unfairly imposed or forced onto the Latino community. At the end of 2021, a poll titled "The Use of Latinx Among Hispanic Voters" was published and shared widely online. For weeks, guest essays and columns written by right-leaning propagandists cited this poll and launched a misinformation campaign during the 2021 holiday season, armed with statistical data, quantifiable charts and numbers, or rather by drawing on old colonial innovations invented to capitalize on private empires in order to drive a wedge and further divide our community to keep us distracted and away from achieving social progress. This effort sought to reframe this inclusive word, Latinx, as a divisive dog whistle term that fit neatly within a narrative of being an oppressive boogeyman. It's as if they would have us believe Latinx was invented during a conference between white neoliberal elites, as if the LGBTQIA+ community had nothing to do about its origins. Given the complexity and heterogeneity of our communities, it came as little surprise to me when LULAC, the oldest Hispanic and Latino civil rights organization in the United States, publicly announced that they would ban their use of Latinx in their official communication shortly after the poll was released. This is an ill-informed decision that signals to the world that the elders within the Latinx community are complicit in upholding a culture of de facto heteropatriarchy where mainstream moral and political philosophy would prefer to continue to keep the LGBTQAI+ folks to the margins. Now, I have a few items I'd like to address during this short time, so if I don't get to them, these include mental health advocacy, emphasis on the strong historical connection between the Black and Latinx community, explanation of Jim Crow 2.0 in Texas politics, and long-distance installation challenges during the pandemic. So I'll move on to the next slide, please. So for the uninitiated, surveillance capitalism is Harvard Law professor Shoshana Zuboff's name for the untamed rogue version of capitalism that is founded on behavioral futures markets and has consequently taken over our economy. Creating a world without choices via an abundance of affordable smart devices controlling your every move. Combining her theory with a greater understanding of US and Texas history after reading Natalia Molina's How Race is Made in America, which she talks about racial scripts, and Monica Muñoz Martinez's book on Texas violence called The Injustice Never Leaves You. Not the mythology we learned in schools, but the unabridged version of events. I gained a greater sense for what has led to our high-tech border policing market in Texas, understanding that Texas slavery was big business and that the moral and ethical psychology that allowed slavery as a business to thrive is embedded within our government policy still. This is the same moral and ethical reasoning that's selling these high-tech policing solutions to problems created by the legacy of colonization. The 1836 Project, or critical Alamo theory, is an attempt to reframe Texas history lessons and play down references to slavery and anti-ethnic Mexican discrimination that is the real story of the state's founding. It's a part of this moral and ideological conditioning project by the state to promote its own state religion. It's the law that prevents teachers from teaching the facts, that Davy Crockett, William B. Travis, and Jim Bowie were each slave owners, that they died unheroically and were defeated by the Mexican army. So I researched at art pace how to develop a visual aesthetic for this during my time as an artist in residence recently in 2021. And ultimately what I did was create and combine Hollywood Western icons, because we all know that it's not just Westerns, but Hollywood in general that fills unflattering depictions of Latinx as racialized threats or bandits and glamorizing vigilante violence against us. So I merged these images with high-tech Chicanx set of icons that I've been working from in my La Raza Cosmica series of screen prints. Shout out to Julia at Overpass Projects. This legacy of Texas still haunts us today. Next slide, please. As we approach the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Border Patrol in 2024, we need to reassess our values as a democratic nation. We need to increase our multicultural competency. And as Latinx, we need to do better and advocate for Black liberatory struggle and unite in order to overcome our shared historical oppression. We are symbiotic communities united in the same struggle for equity and liberation. There is no Latinx community without the Black community. You are a part of us, and we are a part of you. U.S. history has promoted myths of resource scarcity in a divide and conquer strategy. Heather McGhee characterizes this as a zero-sum game in her book called The Sum of Us. The subliminal words in targeting and targeted ads, they call us users, that they want us to endlessly grind and hustle. What a pity this gig economy brainwashing colonial strategy has us under is the spell of endlessly capitalizing and competing for attention and money instead of promoting mutual aid projects and collective action that meaningfully connects communities and supports POC abolition and equity. They will have us subscribing to a FOMO mentality, an economy of complicity saying yes to everything. What we have is a pattern of institutional assimilation, a chilling effect society, a non-creative society that is constantly self-conscious about themselves in the third person, always critical. Coming to an understanding of my own liberatory struggle through the readings of the Black liberation struggle, the Black freedom struggle, the Black Power movement, Black Lives Matter movement for liberation. These movements for equality should signal to Latinx folks an understanding that race is a technology created by white people to benefit white people in their capitalistic efforts to colonize natural resources as their private property, and that extends to people that they deemed inferior and forever in service to them and their empires. Once we understand that American popular culture was not invented until the commodified Black minstrel shows, then we have an understanding of the American tradition within the entertainment industry. Texas is still ripe and fat with imported European cultural baggage. We need to remain mindful not to become U.S. capitalist POC puppets that generate social revenue and attention for corporations. They will use POC as cultural puppets. So I want to call for a rebellion. Urge the digitally motivated Americans to revolt. Constantly, signaling and flexing our self-image as respectable, intellectual, rational, assimilated people as a display of our social worthiness is not working. At least it does not work for me. This is the kind of respectability that imprisons us into competition that forever divides us. So I urge you, next slide, please. Take up intellectual space, sustain your practice, take care of your mind and body and spirit, opt out, log out, unsubscribe, sign off, read a book. You don't have to commodify yourself or your life for anyone's corporate profits. We're living in an era of frictionless capitalist consumption. I'm not going to allow my work to be consumed without critical interpretation. So I'm calling for mental health advocacy, high-tech border policing within our own communities and homes via smart devices, is the new social conditions that we have to live in and have no choice but to accept in our homes. So if we're going to advocate for new Latinx artwork as an artist, I'm calling for a Latinx futurist aesthetic. Next slide, please. Influenced personally by Nickelodeon cartoons with high-tech tools advocating for BIPOC and LGBTQII+ liberation. Next slide, please. These innovations of colonization are relatively new in human history, and the world was a place without these for centuries, and it can be again if we struggle to dismantle the system. Until then, I want to end with a quote by activist and abolitionist Miriam Kaba, that hope is a discipline. I'd now like to turn it over to Delilah Montoya. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Hi there. Thank you, Michael, for that, for sharing your work with us. I found it really very, very interesting. So can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. All right. I'd like to start with the First Nation in Albuquerque, where I reside, are the Tewa of the San Diaz and Diez Pueblos. Could you have my slide up, please? Thank you. I'm grateful for their guardianship of the bosque, high plains and mountains. Everything built here resonates from their presence and knowledge. I recognize the contributions of indigenous women such as Malanali, also known as Malinche, to our cultural growth. These last 2 years have been a testament of our ability for resistance, reaffirmation, and resilience. Certainly, resistance and affirmation are brought to light by the Cara exhibition in 1990, but the Latinx resilience contributes positively to our cultural maturity. Through support by fellow Latinx artists such as the late Yolanda Lopez, whose mentorship for so many of us helped inspire careers, as well as Laura Aguilar, whose practice was so much about resilience. I would like to take a moment to thank Celia Munoz and of course Santa Barraza, who helped me mature my own practice through our conversations, collaborations, and providing each other opportunities. I also thank the USLAF community for their mentorship and friendship. Throughout my practice, I seek ideas that affirm our Latinx place within the American continents as a contributor to history and the US cultural fabric. My current interest includes collaborating with Houston artist activist groups such as Sinueas and Menchaca, HTX, as well as defining racism by producing a sort of mimic of the colonial casta paintings. This series is titled Contemporary Casta Portraiture, Nuestra Calidad. On screen is casta number 2 and is one of the 16 portraits where families are asked to be actors of their own lives. Next slide, please. Next slide. Nuestra Calidad is an ethnographic art series that examines the roots of families with colonial heritage by DNA testing their descendants. This project builds on the paradigm that colonial families of the New World evolved from a global community. The nuances woven into the topic are identity, colonial power struggles, family history, the optic unconscious, and biogeographic ethnography, and how these experiences are expressed in our contemporary lives and culture. Of course, this all goes back to the theme of hybridity. On the left of your screen is a 1763 painting by Miguel Cabrera, where an inscription reads, de Español y de India mestiza. I believe this can be read as a scientific Enlightenment study. On the right is casta number 1. That is designated to provide a contemporary mimic of the colonial paintings. Nuestra Calidad portraits have three components. The first is DNA testing. The first is a DNA tested image as a world migration map with a pair of test tubes laterally on each side that graphs both mother and father's racial mixes. The other one is a family genre portrait inspired by the colonial casta paintings, and a QR code linked to an online monologue. All this is placed in a wooden box to suggest a curio cabinet. The DNA testing in the Nuestra Calidad serves the same intent as Enlightenment's use of categorization. The great focus of the Enlightenment was a rational approach to ordering knowledge by clarifying the different types. What is still with us today from that era is species naming, perhaps the impetus for the colonial casta paintings. Next slide, please. However, in my portraits, the family brings their own lives to the camera, so the viewer reads what the family chooses to reveal, rather than a representation of a constructed identity to fit an assumed description, as the original casta paintings did. Simply put, my contemporary colonial families represent themselves as casta whereas the casta paintings illustrate a colonial gaze. Yet I question, how much does the colonial gaze influence our perception of identity, of our own identity? The DNA testing of families reveals how global our American continents are as a mixed-raced people, hence giving evidence that racial categories were and are never fixed. Rules are made to be broken, and borders are drawn to be crossed. Next slide, please. Art can be a catalyst for change. My interest is to be instrumental in providing a community platform where truths can be spoken. My role with the Sin Huellas Artist Collective was to put on the hat of producer and facilitate the transformation of Detention Nation from a physical installation to a virtual one. And of course, that was done during the pandemic because you couldn't really show anything anywhere. The Detention Nation installation is a subversive experience that examines the inhumane US immigrant detainment prisons. The members of the Sin Huellas Artist Collective, a loose band of artists, activists that include founding members Orlando Lara, Brenda Cruz, Yadrida Ariano, and myself, planned the revision through conferencing platforms because of the pandemic, right? Ultimately, 16 artists and activists were brought together for the online production of detentionnation.com. And please, you take time to click through it. We're really pretty proud of, we feel like there's a lot of very good information that is on that site. Next slide, please. Cyanotype body prints of detainees and their families were incorporated into Detention Nation. Not only did these prints suggest the immigrant present, but also served as a metaphor for surveillance, incarceration, and death. Apart, the image on the right was conceived as a Sin Huellas action with Jimmy Castillo and myself for the Highline Network Joint Art Initiative campaign known as Monuments for New Cities. There's a tiny subscript on the bottom of the monument, that reads, a 4-year-old reunites with his mother, El Paso, July 26, 2018. What bonds these two images together is US sanctioned imprisonment, that is the mass incarceration of the colonial body. So many of our challenges continue: poverty, no representation in education or civic institutions, and mass incarceration. The question is, are we a part from or a part of the US cultural fabric? Thank you. And I am honored to introduce the next speaker, Celia Munoz. Celia, you're on.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, and my very sincere thanks for the US Latinx Forum for the award, and LACMA for presenting this day and giving us an opportunity to show and reiterate and revisit our works. Addressing resistance, reaffirmation, and resilience, I'm going to add that for me, it has been adding also the other 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And to bring it up to date, I'm going to add reduce, reuse, and recycle, because a lot of my work sometimes is adjustable. I have seen the work as a vocation with goals, a metamorphosis, a natural survival tactic. I see it as a midpoint between what is dying out and what is not yet born. It's a possibility of dialogue between issues and people whose possibility of understanding each other is complicated. My aim, without making suffering the defining feature, is to evoke forces and waves shaping our culture and world with an undertow. If you want to put slide 1 up. Ultimately, and basically, a comparison of parallels between the verbal and the visual from 2 languages, which sometimes creates 2, 3, or more languages. Ideologically and conceptually, in theory, the works are but rough sketches presented as episodes of invention and truth. We're looking at furia and fibra. Furia is a result of fibra, the installation on the right. This was done in San Francisco using Hamlet's Ophelia, who drowned with the aid of her garments, as a critique of the fashion industry's sexualization of young girls during the 80s bulimic period. It was adjusted as Fibra en Furia, an extended installation about international vice resulting from the US-Mexico NAFTA treaty, maquilas along Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, which resulted in killing fields of hundreds of young women, exposing a feminization of poverty, dialogue about something abnormal becoming normal. Second slide. Please Don't Paint My Brown Eyes Blue brings into focus race and attitude with a site-specific 3D wall drawing and 3D glasses of Chuck Berry, who wrote for the masses. Slide 3. Orientaciones is the Dallas Public Art Commission. The Latino Cultural Center, a Legorreta design building, becomes the place for orienting its culture, using digital processes for a floor compass that extends from the interior to the exterior plaza, which I designed as well. Let's go to the next one. Petrocuaro is an Aztec god del fin del mundo, a 20 by 16 photograph of an invented Aztec god, originally presented only as a mask in a performance, later shot with a 4x5 film camera for a Cibachrome process that rendered terrific reds and pinks. I thought it was most appropriate for my Ardley Houston Lifetime Achievement Award catalog to address our current pandemic mandate. The story predicts world's end in this century. I use my family's contribution to the 1918 pandemic. My grandfather, an essential worker who converted his 2-horse carts to pick up and deliver the bodies during that pandemic, left his little hotel, which was on El Paso Street, to become an essential worker. The next slide. De carne y hueso y un pedazo de pescuezo is in progress. This pandemic period has been Dickensian, the best of times and the worst of times. Alongside awards and accolades has been my own journey of entering into the Android world with the help of extra and necessary replacement parts. My past 3 years of adjustment with 3 major surgeries has been a period of resilience too. Adjusting some 50-inch to 70-inch graphite drawings of the body with my own X-ray imagery. Ultimately, we are but flesh and blood and a piece of neck bone. Thank you.
I think now we're going to bring our amazing panelists together. Thank you all so much for participating. Those were all such distinct and incredible voicings, and I just feel just to acknowledge the honor of being amongst you all virtually. Your voices just shine through, and I wish we could have more time to get extended, extended in more in depth into your work. But hopefully, for those out there who are familiar with your work, this is adding to it. And for those of you who are not familiar with the work that you saw, please dig deeper. And I want to. We have some time to have a little conversation amongst ourselves. I wonder if we could just all, I'll throw this out to everyone. We talked about a range of responses in these last years, from mutual aid to digital murals. It's such a diverse diversity of responses that you've all brought. And I wonder if we could, talk about that a bit amongst ourselves, this range of work. It's just really, I think, to me, indicative of the time we're living in, indicative of the kind of flexibility that we have to have. And I think, as a number of you were saying, indicative of the way, and Delilah was saying this in particular, indicative of the way that you've had to reshape your practice, your artistic practices and activist orientations in this last period of time. I wonder if anyone wants to respond to that.
Well, for me, it was like just learning how to communicate with each other and to kind of move forward with the social media, with the conferencing platforms. At first, it was very clumsy, but then there was a lot of really great things that were happening with it. In other words, like we could really start passing information back and forth, and we were able to just kind of like keep moving as we were like re-envisioning or rethinking about things. And all of us were in very different places. Some of us were in the same city, but other of us were like in Los Angeles. And so we just had to try to get, I think the thing that was really hard for us was try to find that period of time when, especially when you're in different time zones, when people can kind of meet at the same time. If we were too early in, like in Houston, then it was way too early in Los Angeles, right? And we had to kind of be cognitive of those things. But I think all in all, it worked out, but it really changed in the way in which we thought about things and began to present things. And I would say the biggest change was our ability to bring in sound and video very easily into the platform, where that was always like a problem when we were doing installations. But I can't imagine how do you bring Adobe in virtually? How do you do that? I mean, I love Adobe, okay? Don't get me wrong, I'm from New Mexico, I love Adobe. And I was thinking like, could I have you come down here and make some Adobe for me? I mean, this would be really great. Maybe we could do it from the Santuario dirt or something like that,
Oh, that's like a whole other project, a whole other process. I feel like incredibly honored and privileged to spend my days like being an artist, living like a creative life, having like critical dispositions against the world. And what's been interesting for me is to see the reorientation of a gaze towards communities that have been like critically thinking of like the present state of the world, like as all of us have collectively experienced it within the last 2 years. We have been like doing this work, right? We have had like these, before these terms even had like, could sort of define themselves, like mutual aid. We've been kind of like practicing these things, right? And so it's been interesting for me to kind of like see like how now the sort of like the powers that be, the structures, the gatekeepers sort of like orient their gaze towards the sort of like modes of productions that are now becoming like more visible. I think for myself, I was in the process of organizing this sort of like really massive in scale project where Castles and I and a group of many collaborators, 80 artists and a core group of organizers and activists to sky type messages over immigrant detention facilities across the US, right? And so for me, it was an opportunity to kind of like harness this sort of like this attention, harness like the attention of folks that were like looking towards ways of like getting involved, ways to kind of like support the work of community organizers and activists on the ground. And for me, it was an opportunity to also think, to imagine like really ambitiously of the possibilities, right? The possibilities of these intersections of like organizing and activism and art, and how to generate something beyond, something that could exist beyond the sort of like parameters of how we've experienced art before. And simultaneously, I think for me, it was also a period of learning how to like take care of myself, take care of my family, take care of my friends, physically, mentally. And I think this turned into working more intimately with Adobe to paint like the likeness of these people that I love has been, I feel like life-saving for me. I think to have a studio for the first time in my life during this period, literally, I think kept me alive. And so I see these things kind of like happening simultaneously. And though it feels new, I want to just kind of like, I guess, re-presence it and say that like I've seen our communities kind of like do this work. And so it's although it feels new to like maybe the ways in which we're collectively like feeling these last 2 years, I do want to like, I guess just presence that this work we've been engaged in it for decades.
Well, forcibly, can you hear me? Forcibly, I've had to be isolated, with the 3 major surgeries. So it wasn't that difficult for me because I had to stay in, but I had to learn how to communicate, with the rest of the world. And the wonderful thing was that Lifetime Achievement Award that propelled everything into action, brought back the works. I had to revisit them and communicate, communicate the achievement through similar talks like what we're doing. Revisit with friends that helped pave the way. So that was a real concentrated period of introspection for me, yeah. And then learning the tools. I started the work with a typewriter, in the Underwoods and in the Royals, and now, we have to force ourselves and ask and humble ourselves too. It's a period of humility because you have to ask for help as well. What I wanted to say before I forget is that it is such a joy to see these younger artists coming up with such force and bright articulation and, strong self-identity. And seeing their faces. One thing I really miss, by being isolated too, is the fact that we can't mingle. I miss all the art openings and traveling around the state and traveling around the country because of our lockdown. The day that the pandemic was announced, I also received a link from a friend in El Paso from the UTEP archives of an oral interview of my uncle who helped my grandfather collect the bodies during that pandemic. So, that fit into the dialogue, and that was the reason why I pulled back and got that Cibachrome with a gas mask, especially with the urgency of being masked, the mask mandate. Yeah. So that came in handy. So like I say, recycle, reuse, also, came into practice. Okay, next.
I think some of the things that have been things that I've been also carrying with me is these kind of where we find these systems of support and systems of care, and finding that network of individuals that either continue to help us do what we're doing, or just through conversation, Celia and I have been able to have a few conversations, and I think even just you talking about the piece Petrocual, is that what it's called?
Petrocuaro,
Claro.
Nahua,
I
Petrocuaro.
have so many questions about it. I mean, more questions. And
It's an invented God, you know. I made it up. Yeah.
but also like this question or this finding that your cousin shared with you at the beginning of the pandemic. And because a lot of what I'm looking at too, with these kind of delousing facilities that were set up along the US-Mexico border, it was in the height of the typhus and Spanish flu pandemic and epidemic. And the fact that, you know, you had somebody in your family that was going in and picking up these bodies, and which is ringing so much of what is happening today. You know, who are those systems of care, and the kind of support. I have a lot of family that's in medicine, and how do we rally around that during this really contentious time? And so it's for somebody who's loves being out and exploring and meeting with people. The practice has shifted immensely, but it's still, I'm still able to ground in these connections with people that I admire and that I'm newly learning about. And then how is it that we can echo the important work that they're doing?
I don't know whether you know, I know you noticed, but that telegram that you showed was signed by Tom Lee, the mayor, the father of the artist that carries El Paso as his name.
I know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. And
Loops and loops.
yeah, that his father was part of the Klan, was writing these telegrams to the Surgeon General. And then his son would go on to be a journalist, right? And draw from war in these kind of depictions. Yeah. And the interesting thing too with Tom Lee is that after his first wife passed away, he remarried a Latina.
I know. Yes.
And their daughter grew up across the street from my grandmother.
Ha. Small world. Small
Yeah.
world. Yeah. Well, I was so mesmerized by a lot of Menchaca's work too. That takes a lot of time to really delve into, you know, the multiplicity of representation. Is he gone?
Thank you. I'm here, Celia. Yeah, I just had to take a break.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. And I wish I could see it live.
Michael, now, how large are those pieces? Are they, because they're so dense that you were showing, they seem as though they could be almost like mural size. So I'm just curious, how large were those pieces?
I don't remember. I think I sent it in the captions, but you know, it's like the size of one wall space that you know, a curator will allow me to fill the space with a digital wallpaper, and I'd like to include animation in that because I animate as I'm designing new static imagery. But yeah, I'd like to maybe turn the camera back on a little bit. So I'd like to flex my millennial muscle, Latinx muscles here. That as I've worked through the pandemic, I've worked more intimately with Adobe. That is Adobe Illustrator, After Effects, Premiere Pro, and I've had to learn how to you know, streamline that process in order to, and it's been weird because I've had to, my work offers a grievance to shared emotional trauma, and I have not been able to do that for the longest time. and learning to love myself through the pandemic, and learning how my own reflection has been colonized, and learning to decolonize myself and my own understanding of myself through these Adobe products. I've been able to elaborate on the gray areas within my upbringing, and just gain a greater understanding of what it is like to grow up Latinx millennial in Texas, because that spotlight doesn't get a lot of attention. And so in a sense, Encanto is a parable for Latinx. We don't talk about many kinds of Brunos. Bruno is the accent Latinx. And so I just want to, contemporize our struggles.
I was going to ask you about that, Michael, too. If you could talk a little bit about if you feel a connection to the kind of the graphic art traditions, especially in Latinx art, and if that's where you're drawing it from, or if it's more kind of a more broad kind of inhaling of culture, pop culture.
Both, but I definitely want to identify my influences, like Carmen Lomas Garza. Santa Barraza also has been a great mentor for me and my wife Susie. It's I understand I don't exist in a vacuum. I have to call attention to my influences and raise the profiles of those who I feel deserve recognition. But also I'm influenced by popular culture. Every day I read to absorb information, and that influences me on how I should approach my work for that day. So a little bit of everything, but a lot of my self-care throughout the pandemic has been revisiting the popular culture I consumed, and the subliminal advertisements, messages, racial identities embedded in those stories, and how they inadvertently affected my own reflection. Just watching like TGIF kind of block party sitcoms like Family Matters, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, things that I grew up absorbing, and then realizing the casual racism, xenophobia, the punchlines, and how they landed, how effective, the laughs are. There's a laugh track. And so we're slowly eroding and being conditioned to think a certain way about racialized threats or racialized people or others. And of course that had an effect on me. And so now I'm trying to understand and reabsorb all that content, decolonize it, and poke fun at it in a light kind of way, but I don't feel the need to stay connected 24/7 and streamline my thoughts. So I curate carefully what I put out in public. Does that answer a little bit?
Yeah, at the same time, it's amazing the kind of mass imagery, because your work is one of a plenitude. There's just a lot to process, and it's kind of incredible to look at the range of works that were presented today, where one might isolate on Adriana's work, might focus on a telegraph and the re-rendering of the text and re-rendering of the quality of reproduction, and with yours, Michael, of the sort of overwhelming plenitude of visual and sensory information that is just hitting us from all sides.
Which is what we're bombarded with daily.
Yeah, I characterize it as a colonial mentality that is constantly, being activated within myself as soon as I leave the house. Those racist myths are reinforced through digital signage, through billboards, through public policies. Everything is, and it's amazing if anyone comes to consciousness and tries to challenge these ideas that are so normalized. And that's been the struggle, as an artist, trying to make this work public, make it approachable, because a lot of the public will not be able to see this, even if you bash them over the head with it. So it's just a matter of taking care of yourself, your own needs, and doing it for yourself, not for anyone else. And so I've had to just decide for my own security, my own happiness, to just exist in my own way, however I can. And hopefully others can feel motivated or empowered to do that for themselves. And so I'm really thankful to have this platform to share, that struggle with you in whatever means I can. But it's platforms like these that allow me to try to generate some new kind of, or to raise concerns I have within the art market that I see as just pigeoned to compete against, other people of color. And like I was saying, like not promote mutual aid. And, it's just an attention economy that we have to constantly resist. So I'm happy to resist that and move the spotlight to someone else.
One of the things that you said that I thought is like really important is that how, the colonialist values are actually invisible in plain sight. It's like we all know it, we all understand it, but you can't seem to put your finger on it. And that was like one of the things that when I was doing the Casta series, was kind of thinking about how do you document something that's just so much in front of us that everybody knows the rules about, but nobody really knows how to talk about it, right? And I know that I was thinking about like the caste systems that were kind of established within the colonial period of time, and how those systems are really still very much a part of us. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to just kind of like take a core sample. Can I take a core sample and just like, all the different kind of like caste systems that were basically, you saw in the colonial paintings, are they still here, and how can I show them? How can I make them visible? And one of the things that whenever I put together these projects like this, I learned things. And one of the things that I learned was like, I had a hard time getting out of my own caste and reaching out and like talking to somebody that was like on the top of the colonial structure, on the top of the commerce structure, of the corporate structure. Can I ask them, will you please let me photograph your family in your own home or business, and then I want to DNA test you? And it was really hard to find somebody on the top of the corporate, because I couldn't walk outside of my own caste system. They would immediately recognize who I was, and there would be all these walls that would get put up, right? But actually, I did find somebody. And if you go through and one of the things that I try to do is not like identify who people are, because the original colonial paintings were anonymous. We didn't know who they were, right? And so I wanted to kind of keep that same kind of like type. But if you were to listen to some of the monologues in there, you'll hear somebody speak about the Wells family, right? Like Wells Fargo, which I just really was like, I was really happy that I was able to like find that one person that would let me go ahead and DNA test them, just so that we could see, where those families were coming from. And the other thing too is like, having to like learn where I was at in terms of my own social structure, because I never thought about it. Not until when you start wanting to step outside of it. And it's at that point you begin to really feel the caste systems and the levels that we saw within the colonial paintings. It really starts to unfold itself when you try to do that. So I mean, that's one of the things that you were talking about, Michael, that I thought was just like really right on target. But you talk about a lot of things that are pretty on target. I'm waiting for your book.
I would love to have some kind of publisher, but until then, I'm just going to be happy in my own space and continue thinking and writing and making, and hopefully others can support that struggle.
Yeah, Adriana, there's another question that that I'm really interested in when you were showing your work was why did you decide Louisiana? Why that region of interest for you? What brought you there?
I was invited to participate in Prospect New Orleans, and Prospect was created in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina, with the mission to, what could be the role of artists in rebuilding the city. And so every 3 years they invite nationally and international artists to participate. And so this one was quite unique because it was supposed to open a year ago and it was postponed. And but through that experience, I feel like in many ways it blew open the way that I think and approach as an artist as well, and the way that I was able to connect with individuals there, and it was really an incredible experience in that facet. It was extremely challenging, and early on, I think it was in 2018. Vincent, my partner, and I did a joint residency at the Joan Mitchell. And so that was kind of our introduction really to New Orleans, my introduction to New Orleans. And it was a really incredible opportunity to get to go back. And so since then, just being able to continue this project that I'm working on there.
So what was your impression? I'm just curious, what was your impression of New Orleans, and how was it that you saw like your past work able to kind of like reside on top of that or integrate into, that cultural fabric of New Orleans?
Well, there's two things that when I was first invited to participate, there was a project that I was working towards, and that really looked at, it was using ballistic glass, and it was looking at these elements of protection. And also I was going to include the song, really the hymn, Amazing Grace, that was written by John Newton. And it was looking at these moments of shifts in our life, but also protection. Mm. And but for me, it really extended into the shifting of the actual project. And it looked at protection differently. Who's protecting these communities who are marginalized consistently and might be on the margins of New Orleans? And when you're not federally recognized as well as a tribe, or what these youth are going through. And so in many ways, it's still aligned with the original project, but it shifted in terms of mutual aid and really learning about mutual aid. But the way that these communities supported one another was a really incredible learning experience. And because it wasn't necessarily the Red Cross or certain larger entities. If anything, they were saying, all over mutual aid groups do not give to the Red Cross. And so I think to me, what is happening in New Orleans, there's so much erosion happening along the Gulf, that image that I showed of Pointe-au-Chien tribe, that is one of the fastest eroding areas in this nation.
Yeah, it is.
And so one of the organizations I'm also working with, Glass Half Full, there's no recycling in New Orleans. And so these two graduates from Tulane University created their own recycling company, I guess, organization. And so with the glass, they are transmuting it back into sediment. And so that sediment now they're using for shore restoration. And so I've used, like Rafa, we have a deep love for soil. I'm now using soil, or I've been using soil, but now it's going into the sediment and how the Pointe-Notion tribe is working with this organization and Tulane University and how do they rebuild, not only through mutual aid, but how do they combat this kind of erosion that's happening. And so a lot of these things happen kind of inadvertently, but also in a really magical way. And so I feel like New Orleans is a really complex city and has so many layers of history and colonization. And so I think in many ways there were so many intersections, and it was just finding these individuals. And I feel very fortunate that I've been able to find this kind of core group of women that have really blown open this other opportunity of engagement and systems of care and systems of support.
Well, thank you, Adriana. And I think that we can thank all the artists and everyone. I think that, just like you were talking about rebuilding and kind of regenerating and talking about our history and our past and trying to reconstruct and heal our own community. We're all doing that and trying to do that. And even, spaces like Mexic-Arte, Latinx Museum, and that we've been trying to also create a space, an alternative space, First Nations voice space. And all of you artists have helped Mexic-Arte and spaces like ours throughout the nation in creating spaces for our community. And I'm so honored and proud to know you and to have worked with you and to be here today talking across the nation. This is an incredible program, and with LACMA and the Latinx Forum. So I just want to thank everyone for being here today. And I don't know if there's any last words that anybody else would like to add. I want to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation also for supporting this program, and also Latinx spaces like Mexic-Arte. This year has also been resilience.
I think she froze.
Yeah.
She froze.
So much for being here today.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Sylvia,
Always
thank
great
you for being there for us. So
and
many years
showing
you've
us.
given.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Terrific meeting you all.
Yeah.